A millionaire and a young waitress are forced to pretend they're married for a day, and they end up falling in love. Before we start the story, comment below. Which city are you watching from? Enjoy the story. Helena worked as a waitress at a luxurious party. She was exhausted from walking back and forth, but knew she couldn't stop for even a second, because the money she earned there was essential to support her family. Meanwhile, Eduardo Vasconcelos, an influential millionaire, moved through the hall as if he owned the place. Eduardo was used to being the center of attention, although that night he was irritated. For him, parties like that were pure theater. Even though he knew his presence was expected, every second felt like a waste of time. He had already greeted the right people, exchanged calculated smiles, and listened to stories that didn't interest him. All he wanted now was an excuse to leave. As Eduardo wandered distractedly down a corridor, Helena was coming from the other direction, carrying a tray of appetizers. She didn't notice Eduardo, and they collided. The glass of whiskey Eduardo was holding spilled all over his shirt from the impact. Helena took a step back, startled, as the tray she was carrying fell from her hands, scattering glasses and shards across the floor. "What the hell?" Eduardo exclaimed, glaring at the mess. Helena stammered, trying to apologize. Before she could form coherent words, they heard footsteps approaching from the hall. "Someone's coming," Eduardo murmured, more to himself than to her, as he grabbed Helena by the arm and led her to the nearest door. With no time to think, Helena let herself be guided. Eduardo opened a side door leading to a small room, probably meant for guests. He gently pushed her inside and shut the door behind them. In the silence that followed, Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room, confused, before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone more exasperated than intended. "Avoiding more trouble," he replied curtly. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Voices followed, commenting on the noise. Helena's heart raced. Being alone in a room with one of the most important guests at the party was the last thing she wanted. When the footsteps faded and silence returned, Helena sighed in relief, but the feeling didn't last long. She realized how easily their situation could be misunderstood if anyone found them there. Eduardo seemed to realize the same thing. He rubbed his face with one hand, visibly frustrated. "Great, just what I needed," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Helena was about to leave when the door suddenly opened. A woman in a long dress, with a curious expression, appeared, followed by a man holding a camera. "What's going on here?" the woman asked, a sly smile spreading across her face. Helena's stomach churned. Eduardo, quick as always, stepped in front of her and raised a hand to block the camera. "This is none of your business," he said firmly. But the damage was done. Within minutes, the incident became the talk of the party. Murmurs filled the room, and judgmental looks followed Helena whenever she tried to resume her work. Eduardo, however, seemed unfazed. While Helena struggled to keep her composure, he moved through the hall as if nothing had happened, although his eyes occasionally sought hers. When the party ended, Helena hurried out with a heavy heart. She knew her fragile reputation in that environment was at risk. It didn't matter what really happened. For those people, the story was already told, and she was the unwanted protagonist. That night, as she walked home under the dark sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get Eduardo's figure out of her mind. So unattainable, yet unexpectedly close. For him, the night had also left a mark. For the first time in a long while, Eduardo felt something slipping out of his control, and that unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. The morning after the party began in chaos. Eduardo woke up to several messages and missed calls. He already knew what they were about before even reading them. The confusion from the previous night had started to gain momentum. Rumors circulated among the party's guests, and some gossip sites were already vaguely mentioning an unexpected romance involving the Vasconcelos heir. Meanwhile, Helena tried to return to her routine. Yet every time she remembered the incident, a wave of anxiety washed over her. She was certain her presence at work that day wouldn't be welcomed. But quitting her job wasn't an option. She needed it, no matter how difficult it was to endure the judgmental stares. However, the unfolding events turned out to be more unexpected than either of them could have predicted. A last-minute phone call summoned Helena back to the mansion. She arrived confused, her mind racing with thoughts, unaware of what awaited her. Eduardo was waiting for her in the living room, standing next to an imposing table. He looked serious, almost somber, and he got straight to the point. "We need to talk." The conversation, though brief, revealed something unsettling. Among the party's guests was a crucial investor for Eduardo's business, a man who valued integrity and stability above all else. He had heard the rumor about Eduardo being in a relationship, and oddly enough, seemed more willing to close a significant deal with someone who had family responsibilities. For Eduardo, the scandal wasn't just a threat to his reputation, it was a threat to his business. The solution he proposed to Helena was absurd, but made sense to him. Pretend to be married, at least until he could finalize the deal with the investor. Helena disliked the idea. She couldn't understand how it could possibly work, but Eduardo, with his persuasive nature, insisted. He explained it would only be for a day, that no one would really believe it, and that it was the only way to keep the previous night's incident from escalating further. Helena hesitated, but the fear of losing her job and further damaging her reputation made her give in. Eduardo promised everything would be controlled, with no room for mistakes. The plan seemed simple, but quickly proved to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The next day, Eduardo and Helena arrived at the event together, walking side by side. He was immaculate, as always, and Helena, wearing a simple but elegant dress hastily arranged, looked nervous but poised. All eyes immediately turned to them. Murmurs spread across the room, but surprisingly, the comments seemed positive. Eduardo, used to the attention, tried to remain calm. Meanwhile, Helena felt every gaze like a blade cutting through her skin. Soon, the investor in question, a middle-aged man named Carlos Montero, approached them. He seemed pleased to see Eduardo accompanied and quickly began asking questions about Helena. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with unexpected ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, inventing small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how she seemed to bring a more human and relatable side to Eduardo. What was supposed to be a brief interaction stretched on for almost an hour. Eduardo began to notice the attention shifting away from him and toward Helena. The guests who typically surrounded him were now captivated by her authenticity. While he answered superficial questions, Helena was being asked about her impressions of life with Eduardo. "He must be difficult at times, right?" someone asked. With a sparkle in her eyes, Helena replied without hesitation. "He's demanding, yes, but he also has a side few people get to see." Eduardo nearly choked on his champagne upon hearing that, but maintained a neutral expression. He knew any misstep could expose their lie. The most uncomfortable moment of the night came when one of the guests suggested a toast to the couple. Eduardo had to improvise a short speech, while Helena tried to mask her nervousness with a polite smile. As the hours passed, Eduardo began noticing something that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Helena was winning people over with her simplicity and sincerity. The very traits he usually dismissed now seemed to make him the second most interesting figure at the event. On the other hand, Helena felt trapped in a role she hadn't chosen, but now had to perform flawlessly. Every smile, every word was carefully crafted to uphold the lie that kept them safe. When the night finally ended, Eduardo and Helena returned to the mansion together. The silence in the car was heavy, neither of them knowing exactly how to process what had happened. Once they arrived, Eduardo was the first to speak. He thanked Helena, something rare for him. Though his words were brief, there was a tone of sincerity that surprised her. Exhausted, Helena simply nodded before leaving. As she walked away, she couldn't help but think about how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. Eduardo, meanwhile, stood still for a moment. He knew this couldn't last, but he couldn't deny that there was something about Helena that unsettled him in ways he couldn't understand. What had started as a practical solution now seemed to open a door that both of them feared crossing. The next day began with an uneasy silence. Helena woke earlier than usual, trying to organize her thoughts as she stared out the window of the small room assigned to her in the mansion. The events of the previous night felt like a blur, but the curious looks and insinuating comments from the guests still echoed in her mind. It all felt surreal. She, who had always lived on the margins of a world filled with luxury and excess, now found herself at the center of it, even in a completely artificial way. On the other side of the house, Eduardo was also restless. Despite being a man used to controlling every detail around him, he felt as if the previous day had entirely slipped from his grasp. The success of their lie hadn't been due to his charisma or influence, but to Helena's spontaneity and authenticity. This bothered him more than he cared to admit. The morning passed with an odd sense of normalcy. Helena busied herself with simple tasks, avoiding any interaction with Eduardo, while he remained secluded in his office. But the calm didn't last long. By the afternoon, Eduardo received an unexpected visitor. Carlos Montero, the investor who had been fascinated by Eduardo's wife, arrived at the mansion with a stack of documents and a new business proposal. With his expansive demeanor, Carlos insisted that Helena join the conversation. To him, she was the key to better understanding Eduardo. Reluctantly, Eduardo summoned Helena. When she entered the room, visibly uneasy, Carlos greeted her warmly, praising her conduct at the party and asking personal questions that Eduardo would never have dared to ask. With no choice, Helena responded cautiously, carefully choosing her words. As Carlos spoke about his expectations for the partnership, Helena discreetly observed the environment around her. Eduardo's office was imposing, but it carried an unexplainable weight. Every detail seemed meticulously chosen, yet the space lacked warmth and personality. While Carlos continued talking, Helena allowed herself to glance at the documents he had brought. It wasn't her intention to pry, but something in the papers caught her attention. There were mentions of a property that seemed familiar. At the top of a contract was the name of a company, Andrade & Sons. Her heart raced. Helena recognized that name. It was her family's company, the one that had gone bankrupt years ago, leaving behind a trail of debts and frustration. Unintentionally, she let out an audible sigh, which caught Eduardo's attention. He looked at her with a mix of curiosity and concern, but said nothing in the moment. After Carlos finally left, satisfied with the outcome of the discussion, Eduardo confronted Helena. "You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem?" Hesitant, Helena decided not to mention what she had seen. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo, and the last thing she wanted was to reveal her vulnerability to him. "I was just nervous. I'm not used to this kind of situation." Eduardo didn't press further, but something about her response left him uneasy. He was used to reading people, and there was something about her that didn't quite add up. Later, as she walked through the garden, Helena tried to process what she had discovered. It couldn't be a coincidence. She knew her family's company had fallen victim to a hostile takeover years ago, but had never known who was behind it. Now everything was starting to make sense. At the same time, Eduardo found himself grappling with a different question. Out of boredom and curiosity, he decided to investigate more about Helena. With the access he had, it didn't take long to find basic information about her. What he discovered, however, left him unsettled. Helena was the primary provider for her family, supporting her ailing mother and a younger brother still in school. She worked 2 jobs and still lived with the bare minimum. Eduardo had never concerned himself with financial struggles, but something about Helena's story touched him. He began to see her in a different light, recognizing the strength behind her apparent simplicity. As the day progressed, they started seeing each other from new perspectives. Eduardo, who had always believed that success came from strength and ambition, now saw in Helena a determination that had nothing to do with status or wealth. On the other hand, Helena, though still wary of Eduardo's intentions, began to notice that he wasn't just the arrogant and cold man she had imagined. However, the weight of their discoveries lingered between them, like a dense cloud. Helena knew she needed to learn more about the connection between Eduardo and her family's downfall, but she couldn't act impulsively. Eduardo, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, couldn't stop wondering how someone so different from him could stir so much curiosity. When night fell, Both were exhausted, yet neither could sleep. With her mind full of unanswered questions, Helena decided to take a walk around the mansion. During her stroll, she discovered a hallway she hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with family portraits, but one in particular caught her attention. It was Eduardo, much younger, standing beside an older man who seemed to be his father. As she looked at the face in the portrait, Helena felt a pang of recognition. There was something familiar about the man, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Back in her room, Helena tried to piece things together. Whatever was happening, it was clear their lives were more intertwined than they could have imagined. And though they didn't know it yet, the revelations they were about to uncover would change everything forever. The next morning was tense. Since seeing that portrait the night before, Helena felt like she was walking a tightrope, ready to fall at any moment. The image of Eduardo's father was a vague but unsettling reminder of something buried in her past. It wasn't just a face in a frame, it was a symbol of the pain her family had carried for years. On the other hand, Eduardo woke equally restless, still reflecting on the information he had uncovered about Helena and trying to ignore the growing discomfort he felt whenever he thought of her. Their interaction that morning was brief and almost mechanical. Helena greeted Eduardo with a nod, keeping her distance, while he muttered something indistinct in return. Both were too distracted to notice the glances they exchanged unintentionally. But the tension between them grew unbearable as the day went on. Eduardo, despite his attempts to remain composed, couldn't shake the irritation he felt at how Helena seemed to be avoiding him. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite figure out. Meanwhile, Helena, determined to maintain her professionalism, threw herself into any task that would keep her busy, though her mind couldn't stop spinning with the questions that arose with every passing moment. The breaking point came during lunch. Frustrated by Helena's insistence on maintaining formalities, Eduardo made a sarcastic remark about her ability to disappear. Whenever he was nearby, his words, laced with disdain, hit Helena hard. She paused for a moment, looking directly at him, before delivering a sharp retort. What followed was an intense argument, but ironically, it carried a hint of comedic relief. Helena, with her straightforward personality, didn't hesitate to point out Eduardo's flaws, while he, accustomed to always having the last word, found himself disarmed by her brutal honesty. Yet, beneath the barbs, there was a different kind of energy, something both recognized but weren't ready to admit. As the day wore on, the arguments gave way to a more natural interaction. Eduardo, for the first time in years, found himself laughing at something unrelated to business or appearances. Helena, though still cautious, began to see more in Eduardo than his arrogant exterior. During a break in the garden, a rare moment of silence enveloped them. Helena focused on the flowers, avoiding looking at Eduardo directly. He, seated on a nearby bench, seemed lost in thought. It was a rare moment of peace between them, yet it carried an unspoken depth. The silence was finally broken by Eduardo, who hesitantly began talking about his relationship with his father. He didn't go into detail, but his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Helena listened carefully, trying to conceal the storm of emotions she felt as she heard the name of that man. As Eduardo spoke, Helena realized he wasn't as different from her as she had thought. He carried scars too, though they were of a completely different nature. This made her question her own prejudices, but also deepened her confusion. How could she even begin to trust someone who was, in some way, tied to her family's downfall? In the days that followed, the dynamic between them shifted. Their humorous arguments continued, but something else was growing between them, a budding closeness fueled by shared moments of vulnerability. Eduardo, who always avoided discussing his past, began to lower his guard around Helena. And despite her resistance, Helena found herself seeing a side of Eduardo that few people ever glimpsed. However, the secrets hanging over them loomed like a shadow, ever present and threatening to unravel everything they were building. Helena knew she needed to confront Eduardo about his family's involvement in her own family's ruin, but she feared what it might mean. Eduardo, for his part, though unaware of what Helena had discovered, sensed that something was about to change. The tension came to a head on a rainy evening. Unable to hold back her doubts any longer, Helena decided to confront Eduardo. She found him in his office, seated in his usual chair, staring at a glass of whiskey as if it held the answers he sought. She entered without knocking, determined, though her courage faltered when he looked at her. There was something in his eyes that disarmed her, a mix of vulnerability and defiance. Without preamble, Helena began to speak. Her words were firm but tinged with sadness that Eduardo couldn't ignore. She told him what she had discovered about her family's company and how it all seemed to connect to him. Eduardo listened in silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the internal battle he was fighting. When she finished, the silence that followed was deafening. Eduardo stood and walked to the window. For a moment it seemed he wouldn't respond, but then, in a low, controlled voice, he began to speak. He didn't deny his family's involvement, nor did he apologize. Instead, he offered his version of the events, explaining the circumstances that had led to the merger that ruined Helena's family. His words didn't justify his actions, but they offered a different perspective. Helena listened, feeling a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, and to her surprise, a touch of understanding. She didn't know what to think or feel. She only knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. That night marked a turning point for both of them. The masks they had worn began to fall, revealing who they truly were. And although there was still a long road ahead, something had shifted. Something that, despite all the secrets and conflicts, connected them in a way neither could ignore. The next morning brought an unusual stillness to the mansion. The air felt heavy with something unspoken, as if even the walls knew that the moment of truth was near. Helena had spent the night awake, her mind in turmoil. Every time she closed her eyes, the recent memories flooded back. The confrontation with Eduardo, the revelations about the past, and most of all, the growing sense that she was caught in something far bigger than she could control. Eduardo, too, found himself restless in a way he hadn't been for years. He had spent the night pacing in his office, the untouched glass of whiskey still sitting on the desk. The thought of continuing the lie seemed unbearable, but the idea of exposing everything and facing the consequences terrified him. Eduardo was a man accustomed to controlling situations, yet now he felt completely adrift. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who make it this far will get it. Now, let's continue the story. Throughout the day, brief encounters between Helena and Eduardo in the mansion were marked by meaningful glances and unspoken words. Both knew a decision had to be made, but neither was ready to face the other again. The tension was almost palpable. Meanwhile, the outside world continued moving forward, oblivious to their internal struggle. Rumors about the perfect couple began to spread among the event's guests. Helena, with her natural charm, had won the admiration of many, while Eduardo was surprised by how many people now viewed him in a different light thanks to his wife. Yet, the more their lie solidified, the heavier the burden became for both of them. In the early afternoon, an unexpected phone call made the situation even more complicated. One of Eduardo's key investors, a man known for his meticulousness and mistrust, announced that he wanted a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or even dishonesty, something he couldn't afford. Reluctantly, he accepted the invitation and informed Helena of the situation shortly afterward. The conversation between them was brief and to the point. Helena, though uncomfortable, agreed to participate. There was no other choice, and both of them knew it. Still, the thought of enduring another evening, maintaining the charade, felt almost unbearable for her. The dinner began at an exclusive restaurant, with an atmosphere seemingly designed to intimidate. The investor and his wife, an elegant and sharp woman, paid close attention to every word and gesture from Eduardo and Helena. Despite the tension, Helena handled herself surprisingly well, using her intelligence and charm to deflect difficult questions and smooth over awkward moments. Eduardo, observing her, felt a mix of pride and discomfort. He knew he was asking more of Helena than was fair, and it deeply unsettled him. The charade nearly collapsed when the investor's wife asked a seemingly innocent but loaded question. "How did you two meet?" The silence that followed felt endless. Eduardo tried to answer, but the words escaped him. It was Helena who, with remarkable quick thinking, crafted a convincing story about a chance meeting at an art gallery, adding just enough detail to make it believable. The couple seemed satisfied, but Eduardo could see how much the lie was wearing them down. When the dinner finally ended, both of them were exhausted, not just from the effort of sustaining the lie, but from the growing realization that this couldn't continue. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them was unlike any of the other tense moments they had shared. It wasn't anger or frustration, but a heavy, unspoken weight that neither could ignore. It was Eduardo who broke the silence, his voice low and laden with emotion. He admitted that he couldn't go on like this. He said that, for the first time in years, he felt the need to do what was right, even if it meant losing everything. Helena listened in silence, her expression neutral, but her eyes revealed the turmoil within her. When he finished speaking, it was Helena's turn. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted that she, too, was tired of the lie but feared the consequences. For her, Eduardo represented much of what she had always despised: privilege, arrogance, and power. Yet, at the same time, she was beginning to see something deeper in him, something that confused her. The final decision came as a silent agreement between the two. The next morning, they would reveal the truth, regardless of the consequences. They spent the rest of the night in their respective rooms, each reflecting on what they had built, or perhaps destroyed together. When the sun finally rose, casting new light over the mansion, Eduardo and Helena were ready to face the world. Though they didn't know what the future held, there was an unspoken certainty between them. Even though it had all started with a lie, what they had shared was real. And that, in some way, gave them the courage to face whatever came next. The new day arrived, heavy with an atmosphere of uncertainty and tension. Helena and Eduardo woke earlier than usual, each lost in their own thoughts. It was time to reveal the truth, but the weight of that decision felt even heavier now, with the morning light making everything seem more stark and clear. Helena went down to the kitchen in search of a strong cup of coffee to ease the anxiety knotting in her stomach. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained in his office, staring out the window with a distant gaze. He knew that confessing the lie would risk not only his reputation but also his fragile relationship with Helena, which already seemed on the verge of collapse. When they finally met in the living room, neither spoke immediately. Helena gripped her coffee cup tightly as if it were an anchor, while Eduardo seemed to struggle to find the right words. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was charged with expectation and fear. Finally, Eduardo broke the silence. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, explaining how they would approach the guests and investors. His plan was simple, yet risky. Admit the mistake, take full responsibility, and try to salvage whatever they could. He assured Helena that she had nothing to lose, and that all the blame would be his. Helena listened intently, but something inside her felt unsettled. It wasn't just fear of what might happen, but the sense that, over their time together, something genuine had developed between them. Though everything had started with a lie, she couldn't ignore the moments when Eduardo had shown vulnerability, care, and even a kind of unexpected kindness. The first test came shortly after breakfast, when one of Eduardo's assistants arrived with a list of investors expecting a meeting that afternoon. Eduardo knew he had to be honest, but his nerves were evident in his every move. Helena noticed how anxious he was and, almost instinctively, placed her hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture but one full of meaning. "You can do this," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainties racing through her mind. When the moment arrived, Eduardo and Helena stood together before a small group of influential individuals gathered in the mansion's main hall. Eduardo began to speak, his posture stiff, but his voice filled with sincere emotion. He admitted to lying about his relationship with Helena, explaining that the situation had spiraled out of control quickly, and that, in a moment of desperation, he had made poor decisions. As Eduardo spoke, Helena felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Some faces showed surprise, others disbelief, but what affected her most was realizing that Eduardo was taking all the blame. He made it clear that Helena had no choice in the matter, that she had simply helped him in a time of need. When he finished, An uncomfortable silence filled the room. It seemed as though everyone was processing Eduardo's words. One of the senior investors, a man with a stern expression and an authoritative tone, was the first to break the silence. He asked direct questions, probing the reasons behind the lie and its potential impact on the business. Eduardo responded with honesty, admitting that he had risked everything but affirming his willingness to face the consequences. Helena watched silently, torn. On one hand, she admired Eduardo's courage in owning his mistakes. On the other, she felt that he was still trying to shield her, even if it meant sacrificing more of himself. When they were finally alone after hours of explanations and confrontations, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Eduardo looked visibly drained, his shoulders slumped as if he carried the weight of the world. Helena, who had remained silent until then, felt compelled to speak. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "You didn't have to take it all on yourself." Eduardo looked up, surprised by her words. He didn't respond immediately, but something in his eyes conveyed gratitude and regret. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Many of the investors chose to continue their partnerships with Eduardo, impressed by his honesty, while others decided to sever ties, citing a lack of trust in someone who had lied. For Eduardo, every loss was deeply felt, but he also knew he couldn't continue living in a web of appearances. As for Helena, she decided to stay at the mansion for a few more days, helping Eduardo manage the aftermath. During that time, the two began sharing more honest moments without the pressure of maintaining a facade. Gradually, their relationship started to transform. It was no longer defined by distrust or deception, but by something more authentic. Still, there was much to resolve. Helena continued to wrestle with doubts about her feelings for Eduardo and whether she could fully trust him. Eduardo, meanwhile, struggled with his own insecurities, trying to prove to himself that he could be someone different, someone better. The future remained uncertain, but they shared one thing: a determination to face whatever came next together. Even though their story had started with a lie, they now sought something real, something that could endure beyond the confusion and mistakes of the past. The days that followed were intense and transformative for both Eduardo and Helena. The chaos of the event seemed to fade, but something new emerged, a connection neither of them could deny. For Eduardo, every moment with Helena revealed layers of a woman he had never expected to know. She was direct, strong, and yet delicate in the way she faced life. There was something irresistible about how genuine she seemed in every word and gesture. Helena, on the other hand, continued to wrestle with a whirlwind of emotions. Eduardo was no longer just the distant millionaire she had judged at first. He was proving to be human, vulnerable, and that vulnerability touched her in ways she didn't know how to process. Yet, even as her heart wavered, Helena remained cautious. After all, Eduardo still embodied many things she rejected, and trusting him completely felt like a risk. One afternoon, Eduardo was in the library, seemingly reviewing documents that demanded his attention, though his thoughts were far from them. Since the lie had been exposed, he felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. When Helena entered the room carrying a tray with tea she had prepared for him, Eduardo felt the now familiar tightening in his chest. She placed the tray on the table without saying a word and turned to leave. But something made him call out to her. "Helena, can you wait a moment?" She stopped, hesitating, and then turned, her eyes filled with curiosity. Eduardo watched her, noticing how her hair fell in soft waves around her face and how her eyes carried both exhaustion and determination. "I just wanted to thank you for everything, not just for what you did that day, but for being by my side since then." Helena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to process his words. Eduardo wasn't often this open, and it left her feeling unsettled. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet tranquility, but something had shifted. Eduardo felt Helena's presence in a way that seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. It was as if she were the only person who truly saw beyond the layers he had built over the years. Later, as they walked through the garden, the autumn air seemed to bring them closer. Leaves were beginning to fall, creating a golden carpet along the path. Without thinking, Eduardo extended his hand to help Helena down a small incline. When their fingers touched, an unexpected warmth surged through him. He quickly let go, as though he had made a mistake, but the touch lingered in his mind. It was a simple, almost imperceptible gesture, yet for Eduardo it was a reminder that something within him was changing. As they continued walking, Helena began talking about her childhood and how her mother used to say, "What's true will always stand the test of time." Eduardo listened intently, noticing how her voice softened when she spoke about things she loved. He felt an inexplicable urge to know her better, to understand what made her eyes light up like that. In the days that followed, Eduardo found ways to be closer to Helena, even if he wouldn't admit it to himself. He spent more time in the common areas of the mansion, where he knew she would be. He began asking her questions, listening to her stories, and offering help with small tasks. For Helena, Eduardo's growing closeness was both intriguing and unsettling. There was something about his gestures, about the way he seemed to hang on to her every word, that made her feel special. Yet there was also the shadow of his past, the secrets she still didn't fully understand, that kept her from giving in to this budding feeling. One rainy evening, they found themselves together in the living room, where Eduardo had lit a fire in the fireplace. Helena was reading a book, and Eduardo, seated on the opposite couch, pretended to work on his laptop. But in truth, he couldn't take his eyes off her. He noticed things he hadn't before. How she scrunched her nose slightly when she was focused, how her posture relaxed when she was immersed in reading. Without meaning to, Eduardo began imagining what it would be like to have Helena by his side, not as part of a charade, but as something real. Yet he knew that before that could happen, he had to confront his own demons. The secrets he kept, the choices he had made in the past, all of it loomed as a barrier between them. And above all, he needed to prove to Helena and to himself that he could be the man she deserved. That same night, as he stood outside his bedroom door, Eduardo found himself paralyzed by everything he wanted to say to Helena, but didn't know how. He knew time was slipping away, and that if he didn't act soon, he might lose the only chance he had to turn this feeling into something real. In her own room, Helena was equally restless. She couldn't understand why her heart beat faster when she thought of Eduardo, or why she missed him when they were in separate rooms. Yet despite her doubts, one certainty was growing inside her. Eduardo was changing, and maybe, just maybe, she could let him into her heart. The weeks that followed brought even more intense moments. Eduardo found small ways to show his interest: a flower left on the coffee table, a quiet compliment about her care for the garden, a gaze that lingered longer than it should have. For Helena, these gestures were hard to ignore. She began to see that Eduardo wasn't just the complicated man she had met at the start. He was someone trying to be better, someone who made her question her own beliefs about trust, love, and redemption. Their connection grew, quiet but inevitable. There was still much to resolve, but one thing was clear. What had begun as a lie now had the potential to become something truly real. The weeks brought an unsettling calm, like the silence before a storm. Helena and Eduardo continued to share the same spaces, the same days, and slowly their lives intertwined almost naturally. Yet both knew there were unresolved issues hanging in the air. Like shadows, neither of them wanted to confront. Eduardo watched Helena more than he cared to admit. He found himself captivated by the small details that made her who she was. The way she adjusted her hair when focused, how her eyes sparkled when she spoke about something she was passionate about. It was impossible for him to ignore how essential she had become to his routine, almost like the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was assembling. On the other hand, Helena found herself increasingly confused about her feelings. Eduardo was no longer just the arrogant millionaire she had met that fateful night at the party. He was thoughtful in small ways, showing a side that challenged the image she had of him. Even so, she constantly reminded herself of the differences between them, the past that separated them, and the secrets that remained undisclosed. One day, while they were walking through the sprawling garden of the estate, Eduardo realized he could no longer hide his feelings. He noticed how at ease Helena seemed in that space, as if her presence illuminated the darkest corners of the house and his life. But Eduardo also knew that winning her over wouldn't be easy. He spent his days trying to grow closer to her in subtle ways. Small gestures were his attempt to show his feelings. A cup of coffee placed on Helena's desk before she asked, a seemingly casual question about something she enjoyed, or even a shy smile when their eyes met. For Helena, these moments were hard to ignore. While her reason told her to be cautious, her heart seemed to want to take a different path. One morning, Eduardo found her in the living room, absorbed in an old photo album she had discovered on one of the shelves. She was carefully flipping through the pages, her eyes glistening as if the images had transported her to a distant time. Without really knowing why, Eduardo sat down beside her. He said nothing, simply watching as she delved into her memories. Helena noticed his presence but didn't pull away. There was something comforting about having him there, without pressure or questions. In that moment, a silent understanding seemed to form between them. They were becoming part of each other's lives in an inevitable way, like two lines crossing in the middle of a map. But it wasn't just Eduardo's gestures that moved Helena. The fact that he was genuinely trying to change was something she couldn't ignore. He wasn't just saying he wanted to be better. He was showing it through his actions. Eduardo began taking on responsibilities he used to delegate, listening more attentively to the people around him, questioning choices he had once made without hesitation. Helena saw this, and no matter how much she tried to resist, her heart began to believe that maybe he could become the man she could love. Yet, the shadows of the past wouldn't leave them in peace. One day, while organizing some documents Eduardo had left in the library, Helena came across a folder containing information about an old project from his family's company. Curious, she began to read, but what she discovered left her unsettled. The project was directly tied to one of the greatest financial struggles her family had faced years ago. While the decisions had technically been Eduardo's, it was clear he hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions at the time. She spent the rest of the day in turmoil. On one hand, she wanted to confront him, to demand explanations. On the other, she knew Eduardo wasn't the same man who had made those decisions. He had changed, but could she ignore everything her family had suffered because of him? Meanwhile, Eduardo was beginning to realize that the feelings he had for Helena were not fleeting. He thought about her constantly, even when she wasn't around. The thought of losing her, of not having the chance to show how much he was willing to fight for her, terrified him. But he knew he needed to face his own mistakes before he could ask for her trust. That evening, fate brought them face to face once again. Helena was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when Eduardo walked in. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the distant look in her eyes, and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he stepped closer and called her name softly. Helena turned to face him, holding her cup as if it were a shield. She hesitated, but finally decided she had to speak. Even though her heart was torn, she knew they couldn't build something real if the secrets between them remained. She began to speak, her voice trembling but steady. Eduardo listened carefully, each word cutting deep. When she finished, the silence that followed was heavy but not hopeless. Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of guilt for something he hadn't fully understood at the time. He looked at Helena, realizing that this was the most important moment of his life. Everything depended on how he responded. The words he chose now could determine whether they had a future together or if this would be the end. In that moment, Eduardo understood that no matter how difficult it might be, he was willing to do anything to earn Helena's forgiveness and love. To him, she wasn't just the woman who had transformed his days. She was the woman who had transformed who he was. Later that night, after Helena's confession, Eduardo found himself lost in a sea of thoughts. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the kitchen floor as his mind tried to process everything. Helena, meanwhile, watched him with a mix of anxiety and expectation. She didn't know whether to expect an apology, an explanation, or something completely unexpected. Deep down, all she wanted was honesty. When Eduardo finally lifted his eyes, what Helena saw surprised her. Genuine remorse. He wasn't a man trying to evade his guilt or shift blame onto someone else. Eduardo was confronting the consequences of his past choices, and for the first time, acknowledging the devastating impact they had caused. He shook his head slightly, as if having an internal conversation, before letting out a deep sigh. Without a word, he left the kitchen, leaving Helena alone with her thoughts. She waited for a moment, unsure whether to follow him or give him the space he seemed to need. In the end, she decided to let him be. In the weeks that followed, Eduardo changed his routine. He withdrew from social commitments and dedicated more time to revisiting old company records. Helena often saw him in the library, poring over documents with a grave expression. He seemed like a man determined to find a way to right the wrongs of his past. Helena, on the other hand, tried to keep her own life in order, but couldn't push Eduardo from her thoughts. Despite everything, there was something about him that drew her in. Something that made her believe he might truly be different from the man who had caused her family so much pain. But trusting Eduardo was a risk, and Helena knew it. One afternoon, while tending the garden, Helena heard footsteps approaching. Eduardo appeared, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes carried a determination she hadn't seen before. He held a folder in his hands and looked hesitant, as if what he carried was of great importance. Without a word, Eduardo handed her the folder. Inside were documents detailing how his company had contributed to the downfall of her family's business. Eduardo had added handwritten notes and ideas on how he could repair the damage, including proposals to help rebuild what had been lost. Helena read in silence. Eduardo didn't interrupt, giving her the time she needed to process everything. When she finally looked up, her eyes reflected a mixture of emotions: surprise, disbelief, and something resembling gratitude. Eduardo, in turn, couldn't hide the vulnerability in his expression. He had taken a huge risk in showing her the documents, but he knew it was the only way to rebuild trust between them. He didn't offer apologies in words. He let his actions speak for themselves. In the days that followed, a subtle change began to take shape. Helena noticed that Eduardo was genuinely committed to transforming himself. He became more involved in charitable projects and started making decisions that reflected a man more aware of his responsibilities. It was as if every action he took was an effort to prove he deserved a second chance. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by Helena. She began to see Eduardo in a new light, not just as the man who had caused pain, but as someone determined to make things right. Slowly, the moments they spent together became lighter. Conversations that had once been tense began to take on touches of humor, and at times an unexpected intimacy. One evening, while walking in the garden under the soft glow of moonlight, Eduardo suddenly stopped. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Helena noticed his hesitation, and instinctively touched his arm lightly, encouraging him to speak. Eduardo took a deep breath before beginning. He spoke about how much Helena had transformed his life, about how she had challenged him to become a better person. He admitted that, before her, he had never truly understood what it meant to care deeply for someone. Now, every decision he made seemed to revolve around her. Helena listened in silence, her heart racing with every word. When Eduardo finished, she didn't know what to say. There was something in his confession that moved her deeply, but doubt still lingered in the back of her mind. In the days that followed, their relationship took an unexpected turn. Eduardo became increasingly open, sharing stories of his childhood, his fears, and his insecurities. Helena, in turn, began to let him into parts of her life she had always kept guarded. It was as though they were building a bridge, step by step, toward each other. Despite this, the weight of secrets and the differences between them remained a barrier. Eduardo knew that to win Helena over completely, he would have to prove that the love he felt for her was real, and that he was willing to face everything that came with it. Fate, however, seemed to have other plans. A new challenge was looming, ready to test the strength of the bond they were building. Helena and Eduardo had no idea, but their lives were about to change again in ways they could not predict. In the weeks following their evening in the garden, Helena and Eduardo continued to tread an uncertain yet hopeful path. The burden of past mistakes was beginning to ease under the weight of small victories in the present. Yet the shadow of secrets persisted, a constant reminder that the trust between them was still fragile. One morning, while Helena was organizing documents in the home office, an unexpected phone call interrupted her focus. The unknown number brought a pang of worry, but she hesitantly answered. On the other end, a deep and serious voice introduced himself as a lawyer representing an old rival of her family's business. The man explained with almost calculated coldness that there was evidence Eduardo had been directly involved in decisions that had led to her father's company's downfall. Helena hung up, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Her first instinct was to confront Eduardo, but something inside her made her pause. She knew that accusing him without hearing his side of the story could destroy everything they had built so far. She decided to keep the information to herself until she found the right moment to address it. Meanwhile, Eduardo seemed unaware of the storm brewing. He continued with his reparative initiatives, demonstrating a genuine commitment to redemption. One day, he announced to Helena that he had organized a charity event to raise funds for local small businesses, including some that had been affected by the actions of his previous administration. Helena was impressed, but the doubt planted by the lawyer's call began to erode her trust. At the event, Helena watched Eduardo interact with the guests. He seemed different from the man she had met in the beginning, more human, more approachable. Yet, amidst the smiles and casual conversations, Helena noticed something that made her heart race. One of the guests, a man she recognized from old photos in her father's office, was present. He appeared uneasy, avoiding direct eye contact with her. Without thinking, Helena decided to approach him. The conversation started politely but quickly grew tense when she mentioned her family and the impact of Eduardo's past actions. The man averted his gaze, murmuring something about not wanting to get involved. Before walking away, however, he said something that echoed in Helena's mind. "Not everything you've heard is true." Eduardo fought against it until the very end, but he was silenced. Confused and intrigued, Helena began to question what she really knew. The pieces of the puzzle seemed contradictory, and she realized she needed to go beyond hearsay to uncover the truth. That night, after the event, she decided to confront Eduardo. She found him alone in the garden, gazing at the sky. The exhaustion on his face was evident, but there was also a calmness that seemed unshakable. Helena approached slowly, her hands trembling slightly. When Eduardo noticed her, he smiled, but the look in her eyes made him take a step back. "Eduardo, we need to talk. And this time, I want the whole truth." He nodded, seemingly understanding that something important was about to be said. Helena explained the lawyer's phone call, the man at the event, and the words she had overheard. Each of her sentences felt like a blow, but Eduardo remained silent until she finished. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to speak. Eduardo admitted that he had indeed made decisions that negatively affected Helena's family, but he also explained that many of those decisions had been made under pressure from investors and partners who didn't share his values. He spoke of his attempts to prevent the damage, how he had been silenced, and even threatened when he tried to expose the company's unethical practices. Helena listened, absorbing every word. There was pain in his voice, but also a sincerity she couldn't ignore. Eduardo concluded by saying he understood if she could never fully forgive him, but that he was willing to spend the rest of his life proving he was a changed man. Helena didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced as she tried to reconcile the man before her with the dark past he admitted to. She knew it wouldn't be easy to trust him again, but she also knew that Eduardo had shown more than words. He had shown actions. The days that followed were marked by a heavy silence between them. Yet, amidst this distance, Helena began to reflect on what truly mattered. The truth was that Eduardo, despite his mistakes, was striving to become a better person. And in some ways, this inspired her to face her own fears and uncertainties. When she finally spoke to him again, it was with a clear decision in mind. If they wanted to build something real, it would take more than forgiveness. It would require rebuilding everything, brick by brick, with time, patience, and above all, honesty. Helena looked at Eduardo, who seemed prepared to accept whatever decision she made. In a firm tone, she said, "I can't promise it will be easy, Eduardo, but I'm willing to try, together." Their journey from that point forward wasn't just about fixing the past, but about creating a future that, though uncertain, promised to be built on a new foundation: truth. The months that followed were a true test of patience, strength, and love. Helena and Eduardo faced every obstacle that passed through their way, determined to rebuild the trust between them. They set aside their masks and embraced vulnerability. Helena decided to join Eduardo in his initiatives, closely observing every step he took to right the wrongs of his company. She also began contributing her own ideas, helping him design projects aimed at supporting small communities, a reflection of her family's legacy. What started as a professional partnership grew into something Helena had never imagined, a bond that transcended mere sentiment. One sunny morning, Eduardo took Helena to visit the old site where her family's business once stood. To her surprise, he had started a project to revitalize the area, transforming it into a community center for young entrepreneurs. During the visit, he stopped in front of a large plaque covered by a cloth. "Helena," he began, holding her hand, "if there's one thing I've learned from you, it's that the roots of who we are can never be erased. This place is more than a reminder of what was lost. It's the foundation of what we can build together." He pulled the cloth away, revealing the inscription: Helena Vasconcelos Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Helena's eyes filled with tears. This was more than an act of restitution. It was a tribute to her past and the future they were beginning to shape together. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type chocolate in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. That night, while walking in the garden, Eduardo seemed more restless than usual. He led Helena to the bench where they often sat to gaze at the stars. Suddenly, he knelt before her, holding a small velvet box. "Helena," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you have changed my life in every possible way. You've taught me what true love is, what forgiveness means, and the strength it takes to start over. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm ready to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. Will you marry me?" Helena felt her heart race. For a moment, everything around her disappeared. Tears streamed down her face as she smiled and nodded. "Yes, Eduardo, I will." After her heartfelt acceptance, they shared kisses full of affection and meaning, like a couple promising to spend their lives together despite all the challenges they had faced. The days that followed were a mix of joy and preparation. The wedding was set for a few months later, and both were determined to make it an event that reflected their journey. Simple, sincere, and full of meaning. On their wedding day, Helena wore a delicate white dress, hand-embroidered, that had once belonged to her mother. Eduardo, in a gray suit, looked serene, but his eyes sparkled as he watched her walk toward him. The ceremony took place outdoors, in the garden, where they had experienced the most challenging and transformative moments of their lives. Surrounded by friends and family, they exchanged vows that moved everyone to tears. During the reception, Helena pulled Eduardo aside and embraced him tightly. There was something different in her expression. "Eduardo," she began, with a shy smile, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, puzzled but attentive. "I went to the doctor yesterday. I'd been feeling a little off, and I found out we're expecting a baby." For a moment, Eduardo was speechless. Then he pulled her into a tight embrace, laughing and crying at the same time. "You just gave me another reason to be the happiest man in the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The months that followed were filled with joy and growth. The pregnancy brought new challenges but also strengthened the bond between them. Eduardo was tirelessly devoted to Helena, while she, glowing, embraced the anticipation of becoming a mother. When the baby finally arrived, bringing the promise of a future filled with love and hope, Eduardo held the tiny child in his arms and looked at Helena with tears in his eyes. "He's the beginning of everything we've dreamed of, Helena. Our chance to write a new story." And so, with the love they had built from the ashes of the past, Helena and Eduardo began the most important chapter of their lives. A family united by choices, redemption, and a love that, against all odds, had prevailed. What do you think of Eduardo's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.